Hi guys, in this video I'm going to show you how to prepare a piece of clay to work as a slab construction or as a tile. So you take your clay and you ensure that you've taken the air out of it, you've wedged it. If you watch the introduction to clay video, I explain why I'm trying to remove the air pockets from the clay. You need to put a cloth down because the clay will stick to the surface you're working on. You can put paper down, but paper will tear. The cloth will actually stretch as you are rolling. I have two lats of wood here that are the same thickness, and I'm going to use those to form the clay so it stays parallel and the same thickness throughout. In the pottery we have wooden rolling pins, and you start by giving your clay a little roll one way, lifting it and turning it round and rolling it another way. Now this is just to evenly roll it to get you going. Now if you're using the lats of wood, you'll get to a point where the rolling pin will just roll up and down across the lats of wood without any resistance, and then you'll know the clay is the same thickness at either side. Now at this stage you can let your slab dry for a little bit if you're going to do a construction and you wanted to cut it later. But we are going to cut down a tile shape. So there's lots of different ways you can do this. You can freehand, you can get a knife and just cut into it. Now when you're cutting with a knife into clay, usually we want the wall, the profile, to be at 90 degrees to the base. So you need to keep your knife upright rather than at an angle. Now if I cut at an angle, you'll see the difference. So I'm cutting at an angle, it's a bit like a 45-degree angle, and this piece has a profile where the side is leaning versus this side, which is straight. So one side is flat and the other side is leaning. You can hopefully see it on this face of the clay. It's at an angle away from us. Now we are planning to cut a circle, and there's several different ways we can do it. You've probably seen one of these if you've ever done any pastry work and maybe made jam tarts type of thing. And with this type of tool, you put it onto the surface of the clay and you twist it. Now because I want a pure circle, I don't want to use the side that's got the texture to it. As I'm popping it in, I'm twisting it a little bit, making sure it's fully through, and then I can take off the excess clay around it. It will stick perhaps a little bit more than your pastry would because ultimately it's a little bit thicker. You can make your lats thinner, of course, and I'm just releasing it by gently teasing it out. I've not just pressed it because remember it will take imprint and shape from my hands. Now we do have some other tools in the pottery. Now you can see that the clay, as I've been handling it, has become slightly indented, so I'm just going to roll again and smooth out the surface. Now this tool is a little bit like a fancy version of the last one. Remember in the last one I was pushing it out by hand and it was potentially distorting it. This tool, I pop it onto the surface of the clay. It's got flat profile here. Press it down, it goes down quite nicely. Again, I might just twist it to release it, and as I lift it up, the clay is under here. I can take away the excess, pop it down and drop it down. Now it might be that you want clay a different size from the tools that I've demonstrated, so you might need to do something different. So one thing you can do is find an object you want to draw around, pop it onto the surface of the clay, and then take your knife and draw around. If you notice with this object, it has a shaped edge, so it'll be hard to create a very clean line. So I drew around it with a pencil and then I've scored around it with the knife to incise the line into the surface of the clay. But notice where I've cut by hand, it's got a rough edge. So in this last demonstration, I've got a little pot again, the same one again that I've just used, and on a piece of paper using a water-based felt tip. Black's good because it usually stands out. I've drawn around the pot. Now whilst this is still quite damp, I've pre-rolled a little piece of clay again. Let me carefully position it. I can take the freshly drawn felt tip line, pop it onto the surface, lightly press it. I don't want to press down because I don't want to squash the clay below. And I lift it up, you can see that the line has transferred. So if you're doing something that's a very tricky shape, this is a very good way to transfer something. It might be a trace line. You could use tracing paper to transfer something on that's very specific. Again, with this process, you've got to freehand with the knife, and you would start cutting into the clay just as we did with the last one, and usually you'd want to keep the knife vertical. So you've seen 4 slightly different techniques to cut or draw around a circle and then follow up with a cut. In all cases, you might be tempted at this stage to handle them and to start smoothing around the edge. Now, you know that I like to finish things to a high level and show off our crafting and skills. However, at this stage, the clay is very, very wet. It will warp and get damaged if we're handling it, and easily squash, and then it becomes hard to repair. The best thing to do is to leave these for maybe 20 minutes, half an hour, or use a hairdryer very lightly on the surface of them, not on the hottest heat. So you don't want them to bake on the surface and then be wet in the middle, because they will snap. So you just want to dry them down a little bit, or let them dry naturally, and then come back to them and just tidy them up a little bit. So if you were going on to do a large slab construction, you might not necessarily need to finish and work these pieces any further at this stage, because you would construct the piece of work and then do the finishing afterwards. But in this case, these are going to be individual tiles. Now, I have just dried them a little with a hairdryer just to speed up the process. Now, if you look at this, it's got a very clean edge. This was the one that I made using the cookie cutter. And as I took it off, I twisted it a little and pressed it gently. So there's not a lot to do on this one. Now, I'm not a big fan of adding a lot of water and hiding over weaknesses in work. But in this case, what I can do is use a little bit of water on the surface using a small bit of sponge. This is just a cut up section of old bath sponge. We've got bigger ones and smaller ones in the pottery at school. And then just smoothing around it. So that's got a very nice finish to it. Now, the one I used making the tile cutter, you can see a little burr of clay on the edge here, if you notice there, where it's pressed down, it's displaced the clay, and there's a little bit of excess. You could take a knife or a tool, just clean the knife blade, and you could finish it by working around it. But again, because it's only a small amount, I can just run around with the sponge, the wet sponge, slightly damp sponge, and then go back at it with the knife. An alternative thing to do is on the table, is just to roll it. Now, this is better on the pottery benches than here, because the table's nice and flat, because they are concrete benches. I'm just rolling it, making sure that wall is vertical. Now, the one that's not as neat is the one that I hand cut myself, where I was cutting in sections and I was having to hold the knife vertically. So this is the one that might require a little bit more work. I might get the sponge again. Now, if I've cut anything off that I wanted to keep, I might have to add a little bit of clay on. Just tapping around, working around. It's just going to take a minute just to finish it off. And this is a tile technique. You wouldn't necessarily, like I say, do this if you were going on to work onto slabs. And it doesn't matter if your tile is square or rounded as this one is. You would still want to finish it to a higher finish than they were just when they're in the cut state.